carriage stopped moving an hour before dawn. Elara knew the sound of exile. It did not sound like the weeping of a tragic heroine. It sounded like wooden wheels grinding against frozen gravel, followed by a silence so absolute, it felt like a threat. There was no soft hush of a gentle winter morning here. There was only the deep, watchful quiet of the Black Marches, a place where no one was meant to be welcome. The air that seeped through the carriage window smelled of wet stone pine resin, and something much older. It was the cold mineral breath of a fortress that had not been warmed by a fire or by laughter in a very long time. Elara sat up slowly. Her spine was perfectly straight. She had been trained since she was a child to keep her shoulders back even when the world was ending. Her faded grey travelling dress, damp and frayed at the hem, offered no protection against the biting chill. She did not shiver. Shivering was a confession of weakness, and Queen Mother Vespera's spies were always watching. "We are here." The coachman's voice came through the small window, with a gravelled, mocking reluctance. "You may step down, Ward Elara." Ward. The word was a fresh cut over an open wound. Just 3 days ago she had been Princess Elara of House Valeray, but the throne room of the Sun Palace had been full of nobles, and Vespera had worn her heavy crimson state gown smiling with polished court cruelty. Vespera had held up a forged decree declaring Elara a bastard, stripping her of her birthright, and ordering her sent to the edge of the kingdom. They had cast her out in the rain at the palace gates. They had put her in a servant's carriage. They had sent her to the duke no one wanted. Elara pressed her left hand against her lap. She wore a single worn leather glove on that hand. Beneath the thick leather, she felt the sharp, broken edge of a gold ring pressing into her palm. She tightened her fingers around it. She pushed open the carriage door. The cold met her like a physical blow, striking her throat and stealing her breath. The winter keep rose before her in the half-light. It was a massive, brutal structure of black stone towers, veined with dead ivy. The windows were dark, like closed eyelids refusing to look at the world. There was no welcome lantern. There was no guard of honor. There was no living soul in the courtyard to receive a royal bride sent in the dark, like a piece of disposable cargo, except for one. A solitary figure stood at the top of the entrance steps, as motionless as the frozen stone beneath his boots. He had been watching the carriage, she realized, since it first appeared on the mountain road. "You are late." His voice carried across the frozen courtyard without effort. It was low measured and unhurried. It was the voice of a man who had never needed to shout to command an army, and who no longer cared to speak to anyone at all. Alara's foot halfway to the ground stopped in mid-air. The whispers in the capital had painted Royal Duke Kalen as a monster. The ruined Duke, the exiled prince, they said he was a madman who had betrayed the former king. They said the isolation of the Black Marches had turned him into a beast. Vesper had sent her here to disappear, fully expecting the Duke to lock her away or leave her to freeze. Elara stepped down. Her thin leather shoes sank into a half-frozen puddle of mud and ice. The freezing water bit through to her skin immediately. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin and looked up at the man on the steps. He came down slowly. He was tall, lean, and dressed entirely in black velvet, a heavy coat without a single royal crest to mark his bloodline. His hair was the dark brown of wet winter bark. His face was severe, rectangular, and intensely sharp. He was not a monster. He was a man who had taught himself to feel nothing in public, because feeling something had once cost him his honor. Down the left side of his face, from his temple to his jaw, ran a thin silver scar. It was not a jagged, horrific wound. It was a precise, deliberate mark of royal punishment. It caught the faint moonlight, glowing pale against his winter-washed skin. Kalen stopped 3 paces away. His deep-set, storm-grey eyes locked onto hers. "I was expecting an assassin," he said quietly. "Or at least one of my sister-in-law's highly paid spies. I was not expecting a child in a ruined dress." "I am neither an assassin nor a child, Your Grace," Elara said. Her voice was crystal clear, cutting through the freezing air without a tremor. "And my dress is ruined because your sister-in-law did not see fit to provide me with a proper carriage. I am Elara of House Valeray, and I have been delivered to you." Kalen looked at her, really looked at her. His gaze dropped to the frayed, mud-stained hem of her grey skirt, standing directly in the freezing puddle. He noted the rigid perfection of her posture. He noted the pale porcelain skin of her face devoid of the heavy powder the court women wore. Delivered, he repeated. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. Like a bribe or a threat. Vesper knows I do not take brides. She knows I do not entertain guests. She knows, Elara agreed. She sent me precisely because she expects you to turn me away. She expects you to leave me in the snow. Or better yet, she hopes the journey and your legendary cruelty will finish me quietly. The wind howled through the courtyard, rattling the bare branches of the dead oaks. And yet Kaelin said, stepping one pace closer, you are not crying water, Lara. You are standing in freezing mud sent to a man the entire kingdom fears, and you have not shed a single tear. Tears are a luxury for those who have someone to comfort them. Your grace. I ran out of such people 3 days ago. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in Kaelin's storm grey eyes. It was not pity. Pity was useless. It was recognition. He knew what it looked like when the royal court decided to erase a person. He had lived it 10 years ago. The driver will take you back, Kaelin said, his tone hardening again. I will not play Vespera's games. You will return to the Sun Palace. If I return to the Sun Palace, she will marry me to the Lord of the Iron Mines before the week is out, Elara stated flatly. He is 60. He has buried 4 wives. I am an inconvenience she requires buried. If you turn me away, Duke Kaelin, you are not saving me. You are simply choosing the method of my execution. The silence returned heavier this time. The coachman, watching from the carriage box, shifted uncomfortably. He had expected the Mad Duke to draw a sword. He had not expected this quiet, tense standoff. Kaelin's jaw tightened. He looked at the high, graceful sweep of her cheekbones, the absolute defiance in her calm, hazel eyes. Then his gaze drifted downward. It stopped on her left hand. Elara was pressing her thumb into her palm, a micro-movement clutching whatever was hidden beneath the worn leather glove. Her knuckles were white. Kaelin did not ask what she was holding. He was a man who survived by noticing the things people tried desperately to hide. He turned his back to the carriage. Send the carriage away! Kaelin ordered, not looking at the driver. Your Grace, the coachman stammered. The Queen Mother's orders were... I do not care what the Queen Mother's orders were. Kaelin's voice dropped an octave, carrying the lethal authority of a military commander. You are in the Black Marches. Leave my courtyard before I decide you are trespassing. The coachman did not need to be told twice. The whip cracked. The carriage turned sharply, the wooden wheels grinding against the frost, leaving Elara entirely alone in the dark with the ruined Duke. Kaelin turned back to her. Step out of the mud, Elara, he said softly. The cold is cruel, and you have survived enough cruelty for one night. Elara stepped forward onto the dry stone. Her left hand remained tightly clenched at her side. Follow me, Kaelin said, turning toward the massive oak doors of the Winter Keep. But do not mistake this for a rescue. I am giving you a roof. Nothing more. Elara followed him into the shadows. She did not say a word, but beneath her glove, the sharp edges of the cracked royal seal seemed to burn against her skin, a silent promise of a storm yet to come. The great hall of the Winter Keep was not designed for comfort. It was a fortress meant to withstand sieges built of pale, unyielding stone. The chandeliers, hanging from the vaulted ceiling, held only a fraction of their intended candles. Elara followed Duke Kaelin into the echoing space. A single massive fireplace dominated the far wall, its flames struggling against the overwhelming dampness of the room. A long oak table sat in the center, set for one. An elderly steward appeared from the shadows. He did not speak, but his eyes widened fractionally at the sight of Elara's muddy, frayed grey hem and her pale, freezing face. He looked at Kaelin for instruction. Set a second plate, Kaelin commanded, and bring tea, hot and immediately. The steward bowed and vanished. Kaelin gestured to a high-backed wooden chair near the fire. Sit. You are vibrating from the cold. If you collapse on my floor, Vespera will undoubtedly claim I murdered you before midnight. I have no intention of collapsing, Your Grace, Elara said. She walked to the chair and sat. She did not slump toward the fire. She sat exactly as she had been taught in the Sun Palace, her back, an inch away from the wood, her hands resting in her lap. Her wet skirt clung to her legs, chilling her to the bone, but her expression remained completely unreadable. Kaelin took the seat at the head of the table. He watched her. He was a man who survived by reading the fractures in a person's armor. He had commanded armies before his exile. He knew how men looked before they broke, but looking at the 21-year-old girl sitting at his table, he could find no fractures. There was only a cold, polished defiance. "You did not take off your gloves," Kaelin noted. Elara's left hand rested over her right. The worn leather glove hid the sharp, cracked edges of the true royal seal. "My hands are cold, Your Grace. I prefer to keep them covered." Inside a fortress, at a dining table, it is customary to remove them. It is also customary for a royal ward to be sent with a dowry and a chaperone, rather than a carriage driver who laughed when he left me in the mud. Elara replied evenly, "I believe we have already dispensed with custom for the evening." A heavy silence fell between them. It was not the silence of enemies, but the measured silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a very thin sheet of ice. The steward returned, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of her, followed by a plate of roasted venison and dark bread. It was soldiers' food, plain heavy and meant to sustain life. "Eat," Kaelin said. Elara picked up her fork with her right hand. Her left hand remained in her lap. She ate slowly, deliberately refusing to show the gnawing hunger that had plagued her for 3 days. Kaelin poured himself a glass of dark wine. He did not eat. "Why did she truly send you here?" Kaelin asked. His storm grey eyes were locked on her face. "Vespera does nothing without a layered purpose. She stripped you of your title. She humiliated you at the gates. But why send you to the Black Marches? I am a ruined man. The court believes I plotted to murder my own brother, the king." "Did you?" Elara asked. She stopped eating and met his gaze directly. Kaelin's jaw tightened. The silver scar down the left side of his face caught the flickering light of the fireplace. It was a brand of treason given to him before he was thrown out of the capital. "No," he said. The word was incredibly quiet, carrying the heavy weight of a 10-year-old ghost. "I failed to protect him. That is my crime, but I did not betray him." Elara held his gaze for a long moment. She saw no deception in his eyes. She saw only the rigid, frozen grief of a man who had been punished for a sin he did not commit. "She sent me here because she wants me to disappear," Elara said softly. "But she cannot murder me outright. I am still the daughter of the late queen. The bloodline is too visible. If she sends me to the ruined duke and I wither away from the cold, or if you lose your temper and harm me, her hands are clean. She solves 2 problems at once. I am erased, and your reputation as a monster is permanently sealed." Kaelin leaned back in his chair. He rested his left hand on the dark oak table. "A brilliant, cruel strategy," he murmured. "Vespera has not lost her touch." Elara's breath caught in her throat. She was no longer looking at his face. Her eyes were fixed on his left hand resting on the table. On his index finger he wore a signet ring. It was heavy gold, ancient, and unmistakably royal in its craftsmanship. But the top of the ring, the flat surface where the royal crest of House Valerie should have been, was entirely blank. It had been filed down, scraped smooth, violently erased. It was the ultimate humiliation for a royal duke, to wear the ring of his ancestors, but to have his identity stripped from it, marking him as a man with no family, no claim, and no honor. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She slowly moved, her own left hand rubbing her thumb over the thick leather of her glove. Beneath the leather, she felt the rigid, broken shape of her father's royal seal, the seal Vespera claimed had been lost in a fire. She looked at the blank surface of Kaelin's ring. She looked at the width of the gold band. She remembered the jagged crack on the seal hidden in her glove. "It matches." The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. Vespera had not just erased them both from the court. She had physically separated the proof. Kaelin wore the base of the seal. Elara carried the crest. Neither was complete without the other. Neither had legitimacy alone. Elara parted her lips. She had to tell him, if he knew. Heavy boots echoed down the stone corridor. The heavy wooden doors of the great hall swung open. A soldier in dark armor stepped into the room, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He bowed sharply to Kaelin. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption." Kaelin's demeanor shifted instantly. The quiet observing host vanished. The lethal military commander replaced him. "Report, Captain!" Movement at the lower tree line. 3 riders, unmarked cloaks moving without lanterns. They did not come up the main road. Kaelin stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the stone floor. Vespera's coachman had left, but Vespera's hounds had stayed behind. They were not here to check on Elara's health. They were here to ensure the disappearance went exactly as planned. Kaelin turned to Elara. His eyes were hard, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Stand up," he ordered. Elara stood. Her hand instinctively tightened into a fist, hiding the ring. Kalen crossed the room, grabbed her by the upper arm, his grip firm, but not bruising, and led her quickly out of the hall down a narrow, freezing corridor. He stopped in front of a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. He pushed the door open, motioning her inside. It was a small bedchamber, windowless, lit by a single candle. "Stay away from the door, make no sound," Kalen commanded. "What are they here for?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "They are here to finish Vespera's work," Kalen said coldly, "and I do not allow trespassers in my territory." He stepped back into the corridor. Before Elara could say another word, Kalen pulled the heavy oak door shut. A second later, the metallic definitive grinding of a heavy iron key turning in the lock echoed through the stone walls. He had locked her in. The windowless bedchamber was suffocatingly dark. Elara stood perfectly still in the center of the room. She did not pace. Pacing was what trapped animals did. And she refused to act like prey. Through the heavy oak door, the muffled sounds of the courtyard echoed into the stone walls. It was not the clash of steel. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots, followed by the unmistakable, arrogant bark of a royal herald. "By order of Her Grace, Queen Mother Vespera, Regent of the Sun Palace." The words seeped through the cracks in the wood like poison. Elara's breath hitched. These were not mere assassins creeping through the tree line. This was an official envoy. Vespera had not left Elara's disappearance to chance. She had sent the Crown's authority to finish the job. A metallic scrape startled her. The iron key turned in the lock. The door opened just wide enough to let in a sliver of candlelight. The elderly steward stood there, his face pale, holding a small lantern and a dark woolen cloak. "Miskik," as the old man whispered urgently, "the Duke ordered me to fetch you. There is a cellar beneath the kitchens. It leads to the eastern woods. You must go now." Elara did not take the cloak. "Who is in the great hall?" "The Queen Mother's hounds. A royal magistrate and his guard." The steward replied, his hands trembling slightly. "They bear a decree. Please, miss. If they find you here, the Duke cannot protect you without defying the crown." Elara's mind raced sharp and cold. If she ran into the woods, she might survive the night. But Kalen would be left to answer to the magistrate. Vespera had accused him of treason 10 years ago and exiled him. If Kalen was caught hiding a royal fugitive, or worse, aiding in her escape, Vespera would have the legal right to execute him. He would lose his head all because he had given a cast-out ward a moment of shelter. Elara looked down at her left hand. The leather glove felt incredibly heavy. The broken seal of her ancestors was hidden inside it, a symbol of royal justice that had been buried in lies. What good was justice if she allowed an innocent man to be destroyed to save herself? "No," Elara said. "Miss, you must—" "I will not run," Elara stated. Her voice was quiet, but it possessed the immovable weight of a queen. "I will not let House Valerie's true legacy be one of cowardice." She walked past the steward, stepping out of the shadows and back into the freezing corridor. The voices in the great hall grew louder as she approached. She stopped just behind the archway, hidden by the dark stone, and listened. "You test the crown's patience, Duke Kalen," a sneering voice echoed. Elara recognized the voice. It was Lord Morven, one of Vespera's most ruthless enforcers. He was a man who enjoyed his power far too much. "I test nothing," Kalen's voice replied. It was icy measured and dangerously calm. "I merely pointed out that my courtyard is closed to uninvited guests, even those wearing the Queen Mother's crimson." "I am not a guest. I am the law." Leather creaked as Lord Morven unrolled a thick parchment. The heavy scent of melted red wax filled the hall. "Ward, Elara is a fugitive. She was betrothed by the Queen Mother's grace to Lord Vane of the Iron Mines. She fled her transport. I have a signed warrant to retrieve her." Elara closed her eyes. The Iron Mines. Lord Vane was infamous for his cruelty. His wives never lasted more than a year. Vespera was not just erasing her. She was burying her alive in a lightless pit. "She is not here," Kalen said smoothly. "Do not lie to me, Kalen," Morven snapped. "The carriage driver reported he left her at your steps. Hand her over. If you harbor a fugitive of the crown, you are committing treason. Need I remind you What happened the last time you were accused of treason? The late king showed you mercy and gave you this frozen wasteland. Vespera will give you the headsman's block. The great hall went dead silent. The threat hung in the air heavy and absolute. Vespera had woven the perfect trap. If Kaelin surrendered Elara, she died in the mines. If Kaelin protected her Vespera, had her excuse to execute the last legitimate threat to her power. Kaelin stood at the head of the long oak table. He did not blink. He did not step back. His left hand bearing the blank signet ring rested on the hilt of his sword. You have no authority in the Black Marches, Morvan, Kaelin said softly. Get out of my house. Arrest him, Morvan ordered his guards. Search the keep. Burn it if you must. The guards stepped forward, their hands dropping to their weapons. Stop! The word rang through the great hall like a crystal glass shattering on stone. Kaelin's head snapped toward the archway. Lord Morvan froze. Elara walked into the light of the struggling chandelier. Her grey travelling dress was still damp at the hem, stained with the mud of the courtyard. She wore no jewels. She had no crown. Yet as she walked across the slate floor, the guards instinctively stepped back to make way for her. Her spine was straight. Her chin was lifted. She did not look like a fugitive. She looked like the absolute authority of the Sun Palace relocated to a freezing room. Kaelin stared at her. The storm grey of his eyes widened by a fraction of a millimeter. Why didn't you run? His eyes demanded. Elara did not look at him. She stopped 3 paces away from Lord Morvan. There will be no arrest tonight, Elara said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. And there will be no treason. Duke Kaelin is guilty of nothing but suffering the arrogance of uninvited men. Lord Morvan recovered from his shock, a cruel smile twisting his lips. Ward, Elara, how noble of you to join us. You have caused the Queen Mother a great deal of distress. I'm sure her distress is profound, Elara replied coldly. I will go with you, Lord Morvan. Kaelin's hand tightened on his sword. Elara, no. She turned to look at the ruined Duke for the first time. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the silver scar that marked his past loyalty. You owe me nothing, your grace, Elara said softly, her hazel eyes holding his. You offered me a roof for an hour. That is more kindness than the crown has shown me in 10 years. I will not repay your brief hospitality by bringing Vespera's executioners to your door. Your life is your own. It was a display of absolute unbreakable dignity. She was walking to her own death just to keep his honor intact. Kaelin felt a sudden violent shift in his chest. For a decade, he had believed the royal court was entirely devoid of honor. He had believed the bloodline was poisoned. But standing before him was a cast-out girl in a ruined dress, proving him wrong with every breath she took. Morvan laughed. It was a harsh, victorious sound. How touching, the magistrate sneered. The madman and the bastard. A pity Lord Vane is so impatient, or I might have let you say a proper goodbye. Morvan stepped forward, reaching out with a heavily gauntleted hand to seize Elara by the arm. He never touched her. The metallic hiss of steel clearing, a scabbard shrieked through the great hall. Before Morvan's fingers could graze the fabric of Elara's dress, the cold razor-sharp edge of Kaelin's half-sword was pressed directly against the magistrate's throat. The royal guards drew their blades, but Kaelin did not flinch. He stood between Elara and the envoy, a towering wall of black velvet, and lethal intent. Touch her. Kaelin whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, controlled fury. And I will show you exactly why they call me a monster. The edge of Duke Kaelin's sword rested a fraction of an inch from Lord Morvan's throat. The blade was forged of Valyrian steel dark and matte, designed not to shine in the light, but to cut through armor like silk. It did not waver. The hand holding it was entirely steady, guided by a cold, terrifying precision. Lord Morvan stopped breathing. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by the sudden visceral realization that he had miscalculated. He had expected a broken exile. He had found a war commander. You would strike a royal envoy? Morvan choked out, his eyes darting to the guards standing paralyzed behind him. That is an act of war, Kaelin. No, Morvan, Kaelin said smoothly, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You brought drawn steel into the hall of a ruling duke. Under the ancient crown law of Oakhaven, an armed incursion into the Black Marches without the Sovereign's seal is punishable by immediate execution. I'm not committing an act of war, I'm enforcing the law. Morvan swallowed hard. He knew the old laws. Vespera had spent 10 years trying to rewrite them, but in the freezing stone of the Winter Keep, her forged papers meant nothing against a drawn blade. Lower your weapons! Morvan commanded his men, his voice cracking. The guards hesitated for a second before complying. They were palace soldiers used to intimidating unarmed courtiers in the Sun Palace. They had no desire to test the speed of the ruined Duke. Swords slid back into scabbards with a chorus of defeated metallic clicks. Get out, Kalen ordered. He did not move his sword. You will walk out of my courtyard. You will mount your horses. And you will not look back until you cross the border of the marches. If I see a single crimson cloak on my lands by sunrise, I will send it back to Vespera empty. Morvan took a slow, agonizing step backward, as Kalen lowered the blade just enough to let him pass. Vespera will hear of this! Morvan hissed, his face flushed with humiliation. You cannot protect the girl forever! The Iron Lord will have his bride! Kalen did not bother to answer. He simply watched a towering figure of black velvet and ice as the magistrate and his guards retreated. The heavy oak doors of the great hall slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like thunder through the vaulted ceiling. Silence descended on the room. Only the crackle of the struggling fire remained. Elara let out a slow, measured breath. Her heart was beating violently against her ribs, but she kept her posture perfectly rigid. She turned to Kalen. You are a fool, your grace, she said quietly. You have just given her the excuse she needs to brand you a traitor again. Kalen sheathed his sword with a sharp snap. He turned to face her, his storm-grey eyes flashing with a sudden dark intensity. And you are entirely reckless. He fired back, closing the distance between them. I had the situation controlled. Stepping out of the shadows. To offer yourself to a butcher was not bravery, Elara. It was suicide. It was strategy, she countered, refusing to back down. If I had hidden, he would have burned your keep. By stepping out, I forced him to focus on me. I protected your house. I do not need a 21-year-old girl in a ruined dress to protect my house. Kalen's voice rose, the sheer frustration of 10 years of exile bleeding through his iron restraint. I needed you to stay out of sight so I could... A shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Kalen's instincts, honed by years of paranoia, flared a fraction of a second too late. Vespera had not just sent a loud, arrogant magistrate to break down the front door. She had sent a shadow guard. The assassin had slipped into the great hall through the high gallery during the confrontation, waiting for the exact moment the guards left, and the Duke's attention was turned. But the assassin did not lunge at Kalen, and he did not aim for Elara's heart. He dropped silently behind Elara, a curved dagger gleaming in the firelight. His eyes were fixed entirely on her left hand. Vespera knew. She knew Elara had the ring. Elara, move! Kalen roared. Elara spun around. She saw the flash of the blade aiming directly for her left wrist. She did not scream. She did not freeze. With a surge of pure adrenaline, she threw herself backward, grabbing the heavy back of the wooden dining chair and pulling it violently between herself and the attacker. The assassin's dagger slammed into the thick oak of the chair, biting deep into the wood. But the downward momentum of the strike grazed Elara's arm. The razor-sharp edge caught the thick leather of her left glove, slicing it open from the wrist to the knuckles with a sickening tearing sound. Before the assassin could rip his blade free from the wood, Kalen was there. There was no elegant swordplay. There was only the brutal, efficient violence of a man defending his own. Kalen struck the assassin's wrist with the heavy iron pommel of his sword, shattering the bone. As the man gasped in pain, Kalen swept his leg, driving the assassin hard into the slate floor. A final precise strike to the temple left the shadow god unconscious and motionless. The great hall fell dead silent once more. Kalen stood over the fallen body, his chest heaving. He kicked the assassin's fallen dagger across the room. He turned to Elara, his eyes frantic as they scanned her for injuries. She was leaning against the edge of the dining table, breathing hard. Her right hand was gripping her left wrist. Are you cut? Kalen demanded, crossing the space in 2 long strides. He reached out his hands, hovering over hers. Let me see. I am unhurt, Elara said quickly, her voice trembling for the first time. She tried to pull her hand away. turning her body to hide her left side. It only caught the leather. Please, your grace, I am fine. Do not lie to me. If the blade was poisoned. Kaelin grabbed her left forearm gently, but firmly. He pulled her hand toward the light of the fireplace. The thick leather glove had been sliced cleanly down the middle. As Kaelin held her wrists, the damaged leather fell away, slipping off her fingers and dropping to the stone floor. Elara froze. She could not hide it anymore. Nestled in her bare palm, exposed to the flickering light of the fire, was a heavy, ancient gold ring. It was magnificent, etched with the intricate, unmistakable roaring lion of House Valeray. But it was not whole. A jagged, violent crack ran straight through the center of the crest, splitting the lion in two. It was the true royal seal. The object Vespera had sworn was destroyed in the fire that killed the former king. Kaelin stopped breathing. His hand still holding her wrist tightened instinctively. His storm-grey eyes locked onto the broken gold. The firelight danced across the jagged edge of the fracture. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Kaelin raised his own left hand. He placed his hand next to hers, palms facing upward. On his index finger sat the blank signet, the ring that had been filed down, erased, and left as a permanent mark of a traitor. The ring he had worn in shame for 10 years. He looked at the flat, smooth surface of his ring. Then he looked at the jagged, broken base of the crest sitting in Elara's palm. The width, the curve, the exact angle of the fracture. If one were to place the broken crest onto the blank signet, it would fit perfectly. It was not two rings. It was one single, undeniable proof of sovereignty, broken in half by a queen who had stolen the world. Kaelin slowly lifted his eyes from the gold. He looked at the girl in the ruined grey dress. "Who are you?" Kaelin whispered the words carrying the weight of a shattered decade. "Who are you?" Kaelin whispered. The words hung in the freezing air of the great hall, heavier than the drawn steel of the magistrate, or the shattered blade of the assassin. Elara did not look away. She gently pulled her left wrist from Kaelin's grip. With her right hand she lifted the broken, jagged crest of the roaring lion, holding it up to the firelight. "I am the woman Vespera has spent 10 years trying to erase, your grace," Elara said. Her voice was steady, but beneath it lay a decade of suppressed fury. "And I am done allowing her to succeed." Kaelin stared at her. He turned sharply to the elderly steward who had emerged from the shadows, trembling. "Bind the assassin. Lock him in the lower cells. Do not let him bleed to death. I want him conscious when I have time for him." "Yes, your grace." Kaelin looked back to Elara. "My study, now." He did not grab her arm this time. He stepped aside, offering her the path a subtle but profound shift in respect. Elara walked past him, her ruined grey dress sweeping against the slate floor. The study was smaller, lined with heavy oak bookshelves, and warmed by a robust fire that crackled aggressively in the hearth. Kaelin shut the heavy door behind them and threw the iron bolt. He walked directly to the center table and stopped. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he pulled the blank gold signet ring from his left index finger and set it on the dark wood. The metal clinked softly in the quiet room. "Show me," Kaelin said. Elara approached the table. She opened her palm. She picked up the broken crest of the Valeray lion. Her fingers hovered over the blank face of Kaelin's ring. For 10 years, she had guarded this broken piece of gold with her life, hiding it in seams of dresses beneath floorboards, and finally inside a thick leather glove. She lowered the crest onto the signet. There was a faint metallic scrape, and then a perfect seamless click. The jagged edges of the fracture locked into the microscopic grooves filed into the base of Kaelin's ring. The gold settled. The roaring lion of House Valeray was whole again, gleaming fiercely in the firelight. Kaelin stopped breathing. He braced both hands on the edge of the table, leaning over the restored seal. The silver scar on his cheek paled against his skin. 10 years. Kaelin breathed, his voice breaking under the weight of the revelation. Vespera told the court. She melted the royal seal down. She claimed my brother the king gave her a new one on his deathbed. A seal that bypassed the old laws, and named her son as the heir. "She could not melt it down," Elara corrected quietly. "Because the true seal is not just a symbol, Kaelin. It is a key." Kaelin lifted his eyes to hers. The crown law of Oakhaven. Elara continued stepping closer to the table, her presence commanding the room. The true succession decree, written by the founders, is not kept in the royal archives where any corrupt minister can burn it. It is kept in the vault beneath the royal chapel. The vault door is a mechanical lock. It requires the physical impression of the original, unbroken seal to open. Understanding crashed over Kaelin's face like a physical blow. When my father died, Elara said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Vespera tried to steal the ring from his hand before the body was even cold. I was 11. I saw her do it. She couldn't slide it off his finger, so she struck it with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The crest snapped off. Elara pointed to the ring on the table. I grabbed the crest from the floor and ran. Vespera's guards caught me, but I had already swallowed it. I hid it inside me until I could bury it in the gardens. Vespera only managed to pry the base off my father's hand, the base that she later forced onto your finger. Kaelin looked at his own left hand, the hand that had worn the mark of a traitor. She accused me of plotting against the crown. Kaelin said the pieces of the past decade finally aligning into a horrifying picture. She claimed I stole the king's signet to forge military orders. She had the crest filed down publicly to strip me of my honor. But that was a lie. She filed it down because the crest was missing. She couldn't show the court a broken ring without inviting questions. Exactly, Elara said. She exiled you because executing a beloved military commander would have caused the Northern Lords to revolt. And she kept me alive, degrading me from princess to ward, because a dead firstborn daughter would raise too much suspicion among the old noble houses. She separated the pieces. She ruined your name. She broke my spirit, or so she thought. But she never opened the vault, Kaelin realized. The forged decree she rules with, it is a piece of paper. The original, the one locked in the chapel, still names the true heir. Elara stood perfectly straight. The firelight caught the auburn strands of her hair. Despite the frayed dress, the mud on her shoes, and the exhaustion painting shadows under her eyes, she possessed an undeniable, overwhelming royal authority. The old laws dictate succession through the maternal bloodline, Elara stated. My mother was the true queen. Vespera's son is a bastard of the court. The decree in that vault names me. The fire cracked loudly in the hearth. For 10 years, Kaelin had lived with a hollow, crushing guilt. He had believed he failed his brother. He had believed he allowed the kingdom to fall into ruin. He had accepted the hatred of the court and the isolation of the Black Marches as a penance he deserved. But looking at the restored seal, and looking at the young woman who had endured a decade of psychological torture just to protect the truth of their kingdom, the guilt evaporated. It was replaced by a dangerous, terrifying clarity. Kaelin slowly stepped back from the table. He did not reach for her hand. He did not pull her into a romantic embrace. The time for comfort had not yet arrived. This was a moment of absolute unyielding justice. Kaelin drew his sword, the dark Valyrian steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. Elara did not flinch. She watched as the ruined duke, the man the entire kingdom feared, lowered his weapon, pointing the tip toward the stone floor. He dropped to one knee. He bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward, obscuring the silver scar. I thought I had failed my king, Kaelin said, his voice vibrating with absolute devotion. I thought my duty ended in disgrace. I did not know I was simply holding the line for the true sovereign. Elara's breath hitched. A tremor of emotion threatened to break her flawless composure, but she swallowed it down. Your Grace, Elara whispered. My sword is yours. Kaelin swore, looking up at her, his storm-grey eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. My life is yours. My honor is yours. We will not run to the woods, Elara, and you will not go to the iron mines. What will we do? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Kaelin stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the study. He reached out, picked up the complete royal seal from the table, and held it out to her. The winter banquet is tomorrow night, Kaelin said, a lethal, magnificent calm settling over him. All of Oakhaven's nobility will be in the Sun Palace. Vespera expects a letter confirming you are dead, or broken. Kaelin closed her fingers around the gold ring. Instead, he said softly, she will receive a queen. The fire in the study had burned down to glowing embers by the time the plan was set. There was no need for long tactical discussions. The laws of Oakhaven were absolute. If Elara could reach the royal chapel and place the restored seal into the vault before the entire court, Vespera's forged decree would be legally voided in an instant. The only obstacle was surviving the walk from the palace gates to the altar. You cannot walk into the Sun Palace looking like a fugitive, Kaelin said. He stood by the window, watching the first pale light of dawn bleed over the frozen peaks of the Black Marches. Vespera will have her guards seize you as a runaway ward before you can even speak. We have nothing else, Your Grace. Elara replied, looking down at the dried mud and frayed threads of her grey skirt. My trunks were confiscated. This is all she permitted me to wear. Kaelin turned from the window. He walked to the heavy oak door and opened it. The elderly steward was waiting in the corridor, standing, as rigid as a soldier. Elias, Kaelin said quietly, bring the Queen's trunk. Elara's head snapped up. The Queen's trunk! The steward bowed deeply and hurried away. Kaelin closed the door and looked back at her. His storm-grey eyes were shadowed with a grief that was no longer entirely his own. 10 years ago, on the night the Sun Palace burned and your father died, I could not save him. Kaelin said, his voice stripped of all emotion. But before Vespera's men locked down the royal wing, I managed to pull a single trunk from your mother's chambers. I brought it with me into exile. I have guarded it ever since, hoping that one day the true heir might return to claim it. A tight knot formed in Elara's throat. She swallowed it down. This man, branded a monster and a traitor by the entire kingdom, had spent a decade protecting the last pieces of her mother's memory. Elias returned, dragging a heavy cedar trunk reinforced with brass. He laid it gently in the center of the study, handed Kaelin an iron key, and withdrew silently. Kaelin unlocked the chest and stepped back. Elara approached it slowly. She knelt on the stone floor. When she lifted the heavy lid, the scent of dried lavender beeswax and ancient silk drifted into the air. Inside, carefully folded in layers of protective velvet, was a gown of breathtaking magnificence. It was not the loud, violent crimson that Vespera favored. It was midnight blue silk so dark, it looked like a starless sky, heavily embroidered with gold thread, in the subtle, ancient patterns of House Valeray. It was a gown meant for a sovereign. Beneath it lay a pair of pristine leather gloves and a heavy gold chain. Wash the cold from your skin, Elara, Kaelin said softly, and his gaze fixed on the wall to give her privacy. Dress yourself in your bloodline. We leave for the capital in 1 hour. The transformation was silent and profound. When Elara washed the freezing mud from her face and hands, the exhaustion of the past 3 days seemed to wash away with it. She braided her auburn hair into a tight, severe crown at the top of her head, a warrior's style unadorned by jewels. She stepped into the midnight blue silk. The bodice laced tightly, pulling her spine perfectly straight. The heavy gold thread caught the morning light, gleaming like armor. She picked up the restored royal seal ring. It was too large to wear on her finger, so she threaded it onto the heavy gold chain and clasped it around her neck. The heavy gold dropped beneath the neckline of the gown, resting warm and secure directly over her heart. Finally, she put on the fresh leather gloves hiding her bare hands. When she turned around, Kaelin was standing by the door. He had changed as well. He no longer wore the plain black coat of a hermit. He wore the formal, structured military tunic of a royal duke, charcoal grey and silver. He wore no medals, refusing to display honors given by a false court, but a heavy Valyrian steel broadsword rested at his hip. He looked at Elara. For a long, breathless moment, the ruined duke simply stared. You look exactly like her, Kaelin whispered. I am her daughter. Elara answered, her voice ringing with quiet, absolute certainty. And I'm ready to take back her house. The journey south to the capital took 14 hours. They rode not in a servant's carriage, but in the duke's heavy ironwood coach pulled by 4 massive black warhorses. The carriage bore no crest, but its sheer size, and the lethal discipline of Kaelin's outriders parted the winter traffic like a blade through water. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the Sun Palace. The royal winter banquet was in full swing. Through the towering glass windows of the State Hall, Elara could see the blinding glow of 1,000 beeswax candles. Music drifted over the snow-covered courtyards. The elite of Oakhaven were drinking, dancing and bowing to a woman who had stolen everything. The carriage halted at the base of the grand marble stairs. 4 royal guards in crimson cloaks immediately stepped forward, crossing their halberds to block the path. Halt! The captain of the guard barked. The winter banquet is a closed royal event. State your business. The carriage door opened. Kaelin stepped out into the freezing night. The chandelier light from the palace windows caught the silver scar on his face and the cold, terrifying authority in his eyes. The captain blanched. He recognized the ruined duke instantly. "Your grace." The captain stammered, his halberd wavering. You are forbidden from the capital by order of the Queen Mother." "I am a royal duke of the blood," Kalen said, his voice echoing off the marble facade. "I require no invitation to enter the house of my ancestors. Lower your weapons, or I will consider it an act of treason against the crown." The guards hesitated. They looked at each other in panic. Vespera's orders were strict, but the laws of the bloodline were older and deeper. Striking a royal duke unprovoked was an automatic death sentence. Slowly terrified, they lowered their weapons. Kalen did not smile. He turned back to the carriage and extended his gloved hand. Elara stepped out into the light. The midnight blue silk pooled around her feet like dark water. She did not look at the guards. She placed her hand in Kalen's, and together they walked up the grand marble stairs. The doors to the State Hall loomed ahead, heavily carved with the roaring lion of Valere. A terrified herald stood by the entrance, gripping his staff with sweating hands. "Announce us," Kalen commanded quietly. The herald swallowed hard. He struck the marble floor 3 times with his heavy wooden staff. The sharp cracking sound echoed through the massive double doors, cutting through the music and the laughter inside. The massive oak doors swung open. A wave of heat perfume and light washed over them. Inside the State Hall, hundreds of nobles turned their heads, irritated by the interruption. At the far end of the room, sitting on the throne of gilded iron, Queen Mother Vespera lowered her wine glass. She wore a crown of rubies and a smile of absolute arrogance. Then the herald's voice cracked through the cavernous hall, presenting his Grace Royal Duke Kalen of the Black Marches, and... The herald choked on the words, staring at the woman beside the duke. "And Her Royal Highness, Princess Elara of House Valere." The music abruptly died. The silence that followed was so violent, it felt like a physical blow. Vespera's wine glass slipped from her fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, the red wine spilling like blood across the white stone. Elara stepped over the threshold, her chin held high, the midnight gown sweeping the floor. She did not look like a fugitive. She did not look like a sacrifice. She looked like the only queen in the room. The silence in the State Hall was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of an ocean pulling back just before a tidal wave strikes the shore. 500 nobles draped in velvet and dripping with jewels stood frozen beneath the blazing chandeliers. The musicians in the gallery had lowered their instruments, their hands hovering over the strings. Every eye in the cavernous room was fixed on the massive oak doors. Elara walked forward. She did not hurry. Her pace was deliberate, measured to the exact tempo of a royal procession. The midnight blue silk of her gown swept over the polished marble floor, shimmering like a night sky. Beside her, Duke Kalen matched her stride, his charcoal military tunic and the dark steel at his hip serving as a brutal silent warning to anyone who might think to step in their path. And no one did. The sea of Oakhaven's elite parted instantly, pressing themselves against the long banquet tables to make way. Lords and ladies who had spent the last 3 days ignoring her existence now lowered their eyes, terrified by the lethal, unbreakable dignity radiating from the young woman they had discarded. At the far end of the hall, Queen Mother Vespera sat on the gilded iron throne. The shattered remnants of her wineglass lay pooled around her velvet slippers like a fresh wound. The shock that had momentarily stripped her of her composure was quickly swallowed, replaced by a mask of polished, venomous calm. She sat back, resting her heavily ringed hands on the armrests, adjusting her ruby crown with a single, sharp tilt of her head. Elara and Kalen stopped at the base of the throne steps. "Well," Vespera said. Her voice cut through the silence, echoing with theatrical sorrow. "It seems the whispers of your madness are true, Duke Kalen. To abduct a grieving, unstable ward of the crown and drag her before the court in a stolen gown. How far the great defender of Oakhaven has fallen." The whispers began instantly. Vespera was a master of the court. With 2 sentences, she had framed the narrative. She was not the villain. She was the victimized mother, and Kalen was the deranged kidnapper. "Kneel, Elara," Vespera commanded softly, her pale blue eyes narrowing into ice. "Kneel, beg for the crown's mercy, and I will see that you are returned safely to your chambers. Do not let this ruined man drag you down to the headsman's block with him." Kaelin's jaw locked. The silver scar on his cheek flared tight against his skin. He stepped forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of his Valyrian broadsword, fully prepared to draw steel against the throne itself. But a hand touched his arm. It was a light touch, just the pressure of gloved fingers against his dark sleeve, but it stopped the ruined duke instantly. Elara stepped past him. She did not seek refuge behind his broad shoulders. She did not look to him for permission. She stood at the center of the royal dais, entirely exposed to the glaring eyes of the court, the guards, and the false queen. "I will not kneel to a regent who sits on a stolen chair," Elara said. Her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the state hall carried it to the very back of the room. It was crystal clear, completely devoid of hysteria, ringing with the terrifying calm of absolute certainty. Vespera's polished smile fractured. "You are unwell, child. The cold of the marches has broken your mind." "My mind has never been clearer, Vespera." Elara countered, refusing to use the title of Queen Mother. "For 10 years you have ruled this court through whispers and shadows. You stripped me of my title, erased my mother's name from the archives, and exiled the only man honorable enough to protect the king. You claimed my father left a deathbed decree naming your bloodline as the heirs." "He did!" Vespera snapped, her voice rising in volume. "The decree is sealed in the royal archives, witnessed by the High Council. A decree written by your own hand and stamped with a wax forgery," Elara said, taking one step up the dais. The nobles gasped. "Under the ancient crown law of House Valeray, a succession decree is only valid if it bears the physical impression of the true royal seal, and it must be locked not in the political archives but in the vault of the royal chapel. The true seal was lost in the fire." Vespera stood up, her crimson gown flaring. Her theatrical sorrow was gone, replaced by naked, desperate fury. "You speak treason! You ungrateful wretch! Guards, seize them both, drag the traitor to the dungeons, and lock the girl in the tower." A dozen crimson guards, Vespera's personal enforcers, stepped out from the pillars, their halberds lowering as they advanced on the dais. Kaelin drew his broadsword. The lethal hiss of the blade silenced the entire room. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Elara, a wall of dark steel, ready to cut down the first man who breathed in her direction. "Hold your ground," Kaelin warned the guards, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. But Elara did not look at the advancing soldiers. She kept her eyes locked perfectly on Vespera's pale, furious face. "You said the true seal was lost," Elara said, her voice rising above the clatter of armor. "You said my father's ring burned to ash." Elara reached a gloved hand to her neckline. Her fingers caught the heavy gold chain resting against her collarbone. With a single, swift motion, she pulled it upward. The restored royal seal cleared the bodice of her midnight blue gown. She held it high in the air by the chain. The heavy ancient gold caught the blinding light of the chandeliers. The roaring lion of House Valeray, perfectly complete, its jagged fracture barely visible in the glaring light, spun slowly before the eyes of the entire court. The older nobles, the ones who remembered the late king, gasped aloud. Some stumbled backward, pressing their hands to their mouths. The captain of the royal guard, a veteran who stood near the doors, went entirely pale. "The king's signet," someone whispered in the crowd. "It is whole." "That is a forgery!" Vespera shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Elara. "Arrest her! Kill the duke! Do it now!" The crimson guards hesitated, torn between the screaming woman on the throne and the sacred, undeniable artifact of the realm suspended in the air. "This is no forgery," Elara declared, her voice ringing with the wrath of a denied sovereign. "And the proof lies waiting behind a door no false queen can open." She turned away from Vespera. She faced the captain of the royal guard, a man sworn not to the Queen Mother, but to the crown itself. Captain Elara commanded, her tone slicing through the chaos with absolute authority. "I bear the true seal of House Valeray. By the ancient right of blood and law, I command you to open the doors to the royal chapel." The captain of the royal guard did not move. His name was Vance. He was a veteran of the border wars, a man who had sworn his oath to the late king long before Vespera had ever set foot in the Sun Palace. For 10 years he had swallowed his pride, serving a queen mother he despised because he believed the royal line had been legally altered. But now, suspended in the chandelier light, swinging gently from a gold chain, was the roaring lion of House Valeray, he could see the jagged seam cutting through the center. He knew the legend of the broken ring. Captain Vance? Vespera shrieked, her voice cracking, stripping away the last illusion of her regal composure. Are you deaf? I am the Regent of Oakhaven. I ordered you to cut them down. Vance looked at the screaming woman on the gilded throne. Then he looked at the young woman standing at the base of the dais. Elara did not shout. She did not beg. She stood in her midnight blue silk, exuding the profound quiet authority of a true sovereign. Beside her, Duke Kalen stood with his broadsword, drawn not as a threat to the royal guard, but as a shield for the true queen. Captain Vance made his choice. He gripped his heavy iron halberd with both hands and slammed the butt of the weapon violently against the marble floor. The deafening crack echoed through the state hall, overriding Vespera's screams. The royal guard of Oakhaven answers to the crown. Vance bellowed, his voice carrying the rough, unyielding grit of a soldier. And the crown speaks through the seal. Stand down. The Crimson Guards, Vespera's privately paid mercenaries, hesitated. But the true royal guards, the men in silver and blue who outnumbered them 3-1, immediately turned their halberds outward, forming a steel barricade between Vespera's men and Elara. The shift in power was instantaneous. It was not magic. It was the brutal, undeniable weight of royal law asserting itself over a decade of lies. Vespera collapsed back onto her throne, her face chalk white, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. Lead the way, Captain, Elara commanded softly. Vance bowed deeply, a gesture of profound reverence he had not offered to anyone in 10 years. At once, Your Highness. Elara turned on her heel, her midnight gown sweeping the floor. She placed her hand lightly on Kalen's armored forearm, and together they began the march to the royal chapel. They walked back down the center of the state hall. The 500 nobles who had previously mocked her exile and celebrated her replacement now scrambled over each other to bow, their silks and velvets rustling frantically as they dropped into deep, terrified curtsies and reverences. Elara did not look at them. She did not offer them smiles of forgiveness nor glares of vengeance. She walked past them with the icy, elegant indifference of a woman who had already won. The procession spilled out of the state hall and into the grand corridors of the Sun Palace. It was a bizarre, magnificent parade. The captain of the guard marched at the front. Elara and Kalen walked in the center, and behind them, like a panicked, glittering tidal wave, the entire nobility of Oakhaven followed, desperate to witness the turning of the era. Vespera trailed near the back, flanked by her confused and neutralized Crimson Guards, stumbling over her heavy crimson skirts, whispering frantic, incoherent threats that no one listened to anymore. The royal chapel was a massive standalone structure across the courtyard, built of pale limestone and ancient stained glass. It was unheated, smelling of coal dust, old incense, and melting beeswax. Vance's guards pushed open the heavy iron-wrought doors. The cold air swept over Elara, but she did not shiver. She walked down the long center aisle, her footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling. At the far end of the chapel sat the high altar, a massive block of solid white marble, undisturbed and revered. According to Vespera, it was simply an altar. According to the ancient crown law, it was a vault. Elara stopped at the base of the altar steps. Kalen stepped up beside her, his dark eyes scanning the shadows of the chapel, his sword still drawn and resting casually against his side. He was taking no chances. Vespera pushed her way to the front of the crowd, panting, her ruby crown sitting slightly crooked on her silver blonde hair. It will not open! Vespera gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the altar. It is sealed! By the founders. It responds only to the blood of the king. You are a bastard, Elara. It will reject you, and the court will see you for the fraud you are. Elara turned her head slowly. She looked at Vespera with profound, unwavering pity. You built your entire reign on the assumption that my father did not love me, Elara said quietly. You believe that because you lack a heart? He lacked one too. You were wrong. Elara reached up to the gold chain around her neck. She unclasped it, letting the heavy gold chain and the restored royal seal slip into her gloved hand. She turned her back on Vespera and ascended the 3 marble steps to the altar. The surface of the white marble was smooth, save for a small shallow indentation at the very center shaped exactly like the base of a signet ring. For centuries, Kings had placed their rings here to swear their oaths to the kingdom. Elara pulled the ring off the chain. The entire chapel held its breath. 500 nobles stood absolutely motionless. Even Vespera stopped breathing. Elara pressed the ring crest facing downward into the indentation on the marble altar. It fit perfectly. She placed her palm flat over the gold. She pressed down, and with a slow, deliberate twist of her wrist, she turned the ring clockwise. For a terrible, agonizing second, nothing happened. Vespera let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. I told you it would not. Clack. The sound was brutally loud in the silent chapel. It was the sound of heavy iron tumblers falling into place deep beneath the stone floor. Then came the grinding, the deep, visceral groan of ancient stone moving against stone. Vespera's laugh died in her throat. The solid face of the white marble altar split perfectly down the center. Dust cascaded onto the floor as the two heavy halves of the stone block slid apart, driven by a hidden mechanical counterweight that had not been triggered in a decade. The nobles gasped a collective sound of shock and awe. The altar opened to reveal a hollow, dark vault lined with crimson velvet. Resting in the center of the velvet was a sealed cylinder of polished silver, and beside it, catching the faint light of the chapel candles, sat a crown. It was not a delicate jeweled thing like the one Vespera wore. It was the founder's crown, heavy gold, forged in the shape of intertwined oak branches, ancient and undeniable. Elara reached into the vault. She lifted the silver cylinder and broke the wax seal. She pulled out a heavy roll of parchment. The true succession decree of House Valeray had seen the light of day once more. Elara did not unroll the parchment herself. She held the heavy, ancient decree in her bare hands, for only a moment feeling the undeniable weight of her father's final truth. Then she turned and extended it to Captain Vance. Read it, Captain, Elara commanded. Her voice was steady, carrying no malice, only the absolute clarity of justice. Read the words of the late king to his court. Captain Vance sheathed his sword. He stepped up to the altar, took the parchment with hands that trembled just slightly, and broke the inner seal. He unrolled the thick vellum. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice boomed through the vaulted ceilings of the royal chapel, reaching every single noble gathered in the shadows. I, King Valerius of House Valeray, being of sound mind and facing my final hours, do here record my true and unalterable will. A collective breath was drawn by the 500 nobles. Vespera stood frozen at the base of the steps, her pale eyes wide, with an impending catastrophic horror. Let it be known to the archives and the High Council. Vance read, his voice gaining strength with every word, that the succession of Oakhaven flows exclusively through the maternal bloodline of my first wife, the true queen. My sole and undisputed heir is my daughter, Princess Elara. The woman known as Vespera holds only the title of consort, and her offspring bear no claim to the founder's crown. Whoever holds the physical seal shall open this vault, and whoever opens this vault shall rule. Vance lowered the parchment. He looked out at the sea of terrified aristocrats. Signed and sealed by the king's own hand, Vance concluded. The chapel was so quiet that the sound of a single wax candle dripping onto the stone floor was audible. The 10-year lie was dead. Vespera swayed on her feet. Her hands grasped at the empty air as if she could catch the power that was evaporating around her. She looked at her crimson guards, but they had already lowered their halberds, their eyes fixed firmly on the stone floor. They were mercenaries, and no mercenary fought against a true, legally proven sovereign. No, Vespera whispered. It was a pathetic, hollow sound. I am the Queen Mother. I am the Regent. You are a traitor, Duke Kaelin said. He stepped forward, leaving Elara's side for the first time since they had entered the capital. He walked slowly down the 3 marble steps, his tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow over the woman who had ruined his life. You forged a decree. Kaelin stated, his voice ringing with the cold authority of a high judge. You stole the throne from the rightful heir. You falsely accused a royal duke of treason. And you sent the true queen to the Black Marches, in a servant's carriage to die. Vespera shrank back, her crimson gown suddenly looking garish and absurd against the sacred austerity of the chapel. Guards, Captain Vance ordered, not waiting for Kaelin's command. Strip her of the stolen jewels. Escort her to the high tower. She will await trial for high treason against the crown. 2 royal guards stepped forward. Vespera did not fight them. The sheer, overwhelming weight of her public humiliation had broken her completely. She did not scream as the guards gently but firmly removed the ruby crown from her head. She did not weep as they took her by the arms and led her away, shuffling down the long aisle of the chapel, passing through the very nobles who had bowed to her an hour ago. They did not look at her. They averted their eyes, terrified of being associated with a fallen usurper. When the heavy iron doors of the chapel closed behind Vespera, Kaelin turned back to the altar. Elara stood there bathed in the candlelight, looking at the Founder's crown resting on the crimson velvet. Her breathing was shallow. A decade of grief, of exile, of being told she was nothing washed over her, in a silent, invisible wave. Kaelin walked up the steps. He stopped in front of her. He did not look at the crown. He looked at her face. He saw the quiet vulnerability hiding beneath her unbreakable dignity. He saw the girl who had stood in the freezing mud of his courtyard and refused to cry. Kaelin reached into the vault. His large scarred hands picked up the Founder's crown. The heavy gold oak branches gleamed with an ancient fierce light. He held it suspended between them. "They sent you to the Black Marches to be broken." Kaelin said softly, his voice meant only for her. "They sent you to the Duke no one wanted, hoping I would finish their cruelty. But I have never seen a woman more unbroken than you." Elara looked up into his storm-grey eyes. The silver scar on his cheek no longer looked like a mark of treason. It looked like a badge of absolute tested loyalty. "I swore my sword to you in the Winter Keep." Kaelin whispered, the fierce, protective devotion in his gaze stripping away the last remnants of his icy armor. "Now I swear my life. I do not ask to be your savior, Elara. I ask only to stand beside you as you saved this kingdom." Alara's lips parted. For the first time in 10 years, a tear slipped free, tracing a warm silver line down her cheek. It was not a tear of pain, but a tear of profound, beautiful relief. She bowed her head just an inch. With profound reverence, Kaelin lowered the heavy gold Founder's crown onto her auburn hair. It settled perfectly. Kaelin took one step back. He drew his Valyrian broadsword, holding it upright in a salute, and dropped to his knees on the hard stone floor. "All hail Queen Elara of House Valoray," Captain Vance roared, drawing his own sword and dropping to one knee. The sound that followed was like a rushing river. 500 nobles, lords, and ladies, the entirety of Oakhaven's elite, fell to their knees. The rustling of silk velvet and armor echoed through the vaulted ceilings as the entire court submitted to the truth. The kingdom bowed. Elara stood before the altar, the crown heavy and right upon her head. She looked out at the kneeling masses, and then she looked down at the ruined duke who knelt closest to her feet. She reached out her bare hand. Kaelin sheathed his sword. He took her hand, his warm, rough fingers wrapping around hers, and he stood up, taking his rightful place at her side. The court watched in breathless silence as the queen and her duke stood together, an unstoppable force of truth and power. The carriage driver, who had abandoned her in the cold, had laughed. The false queen had sneered. But as Elara looked out over her reclaimed kingdom, with the only man she would ever love standing firmly by her side, she knew the truth. Her stepmother had sent her to the duke no one wanted, but he was the only man who had ever treated her like a queen,